Now, when it comes to the question of freedom, he actually addresses that question in the first meditation, even though it comes in a subsequent meditation. I think it may be, I don't know, the fourth meditation or something where he talks specifically about freedom. Yep, it's the fourth meditation. But he gets into it already here, and he sort of has to. So anyway, let's look at what he talks about with respect to the libertarian conception of freedom as a defense for an eternal hell. Okay, or in other words, the C.S. Lewis approach. I like this on page 79. He says that the most civilized apologist for the infernalist orthodoxies these days, as I have noted elsewhere in these pages, tend to prefer to defend their position by an appeal to creaturely freedom and to God's respect for its dignity. I like this. He says the most civilized apologist will use the libertarian freedom approach to defend the infernalist or eternal hell position. Well, many thanks to DBH, I happen to think it's very civilized as well, right? I agree. I think it is. We would appeal to creaturely freedom. We would also say that God respects the dignity of creaturely freedom. In fact, if God's highest desire is for human beings to love Him, right? Or if that's a big desire that God has, right? I know there's disputes about what's God's highest desire or whatever, but anyway, I didn't mean to go there. But nonetheless, God really, really wants people to love Him. Well, if God really, really wants people to love Him, love by definition requires some sort of autonomy and some sort of significant freedom for the person to love. Otherwise, it's just coercion at this point, right? And if you don't give space to the other and allow them to decide, yay or nay, to be in a relationship with you or not, to accept you or to reject you, if you don't allow that voluntary aspect, then you shut down any possibility of true love, right? And so, yeah, this is a very civilized position. It's my position, right? And I'm in good company, Lewis, okay? Um, but this is where he takes this. This is how he addresses this, at least at this stage in the argument. He says, as I have also noted, there could scarcely be a poorer argument. Again, there's no question as to what DBH thinks. It's a terrible argument, right? Civilized, completely terrible. Okay, he says, well, whether made crudely or elegantly, it invariably fails because it depends upon an incoherent model of freedom. I don't think it's incoherent at all. I mean, DBH, think about how love even works. Love requires autonomy. Love requires volunteerism. It requires some sort of significant autonomy, which entails necessarily the possibility of either rejection or acceptance, hate or love, right? But he offers up a challenge, right, on page 79, lower half of the second paragraph. He says, if a person could plausibly explain how an absolutely libertarian act, obedient to no prior rationale whatsoever, would be distinguishable from sheer chance, or mindless organic or mechanical impulse, and so any more free than an earthquake or embolism, then the argument might carry some weight. So what he's saying is, if you can show how a libertarian conception of freedom actually worked, that it was coherent, and how it's not different from just a random earthquake, right? Then it might carry some weight. This is a classical argument against libertarian conception of freedom. Basically, those who do not believe in libertarian conception of freedom, they'll say, well, look, libertarianism, all that says is that people make choices for no reasons at all. There's no external stimulus. There's no rationale. It's just randomness or whatever. And so he's lodging a common objection against libertarianism. I just happen to think, well, look, one, I don't think that's a fair rebuttal against libertarianism. The debate about freedom is a very complex debate, and there are many nuances, and he just dismisses it too easily here. I mean, libertarians would just roll their eyes at this. Okay, I mean, libertarians don't think that that people make decisions for no reasons or whatever. Excuse me. Yeah, so besides that, I'm not an absolute libertarian. I'm what you would call a modified libertarian, in the same vein as maybe what Eleanor Stump, the philosopher, has outlined in one of her books. So he's not even objecting to my position. I'm a modified libertarian, which means this, essentially um, that the decisions I make today are really the results of prior decisions that I made yesterday or the day before or years before. So the idea is that the more decisions I make toward one thing, say a good thing, then that helps solidify my character such that bad decisions become less of an option for me. So I don't think that that my decisions now are just not based on anything. No, they're based on prior decisions. They're based on lots of things, right? But I'm not a compatibilist, and I'm certainly not a determinist. So modified libertarian. Okay, maybe we can talk about that at some other point. But then he goes on to tell us what he thinks about freedom, and it's pretty revealing. At the bottom of page 79, the last full sentence, it looks like he says, "But to me it seems impossible to speak of freedom in any meaningful sense at all, unless one begins from the assumption that for a rational spirit, to see the good and know it truly is to desire it insatiably and to obey it unconditionally, while not to desire it is not to have known it truly, and so never to have been free to choose it." There's a lot to say here, but I'm thinking he's confusing what it means to know. I think it's possible for a person to know about God and still make a meaningful decision that they don't want to know more about God. That is to say, they don't want to have an intimate relationship, a personal relationship with God, right? And he seems to be collapsing these two things together, because he thinks to know about God, at least in a full sense, in a rational sense, is to at the same time embrace God. Now, there's an element here that maybe I agree with, is that what he's essentially saying is that God's being, God's presence is completely irresistible, right? Once you really behold him, once you really see him, once you really know him, you just can't help, as a creature, as one of his creatures, God's creatures, you're just going to be drawn to him. Now, I think that is plausible, and I like to entertain ideas like that. Even though I'm not a Calvinist, I think something like that may be true. And so in DBH's mind, he says, well, if that is true, then to really know God is to just full-fledged embrace him. And there's no rule, at least eternally, there's no way that a person could say no to God, right? If they're saying no to God, that just means they're being irrational. And if they're doing something irrational, then God can't sentence them to hell forever anyway, because that would be unjust of God to send a person who isn't thinking right to hell or whatever, because they weren't making a fully informed decision. Had they had a fully informed decision, then they would have chosen God. Okay, but but I think that we just need to take a few steps back here and say, no, I think it's perfectly coherent to say that a person can have an initial vision of God, an initial knowing about God, and then based on that decision, or based on that experience, they can make a decision whether they want to proceed further in knowing God or just reject him altogether. So imagine it goes like this. Suppose it is the case that to fully behold God as he is that's an irresistible experience. You will come to him. Let's just play that game, right? Because I think something like that may be true. Well, it's conceivable that God will not grant a person that access to himself if they don't want it, right? You see this throughout the Gospels, right? If a person maybe they know about God, maybe it's a Pharisee and they know enough about God to condemn themselves, right? But if their hearts aren't sincere, if they really don't want God, then Jesus, he says, don't cast your pearl before swine. He doesn't grant more grace to people who just at the end of the day don't want it, right? So he allows them to continue in their sin and go off to their own devices and their own ways. Okay, well, suppose something like that happens where a person, they hear the gospel, so they know just enough about God to make a decision if they want to proceed further in their relationship to God. And God will not let them proceed further unless they really want it, and unless they express that to him. Then he'll give them a vision of himself, in which case he will draw them irresistibly to himself, right? So my conception of freedom, I think, is perfectly coherent here, is that I think it's perfectly coherent to say that a person could reject God conceivably forever in not only the present moment, but in every subsequent present moment, every subsequent moment that a person has. Maybe they know enough about God that they just don't want to proceed further, and that's based on their own choice and their own freedom to decide. Because if they ever decide for God, then God would grant them that grace. So anyway, but in order to maintain my view here, you're going to have a distinction between knowing about God and actually knowing God intimately. And that's not a distinction that I see here on page 79 and 80 when he's talking about knowing God. Because again, he says that it seems impossible to speak of freedom in any meaningful sense at all unless one begins from the assumption that for a rational spirit to see the good and know the good truly is to desire it insatiably and to obey it unconditionally. Yeah, but again, I'm not so sure I agree with that, and it kind of depends on what he means here. But I think it's possible to be a rational spirit and to know enough about the good, and to know enough truly about the good, that they may not want to proceed further. In which case, God honors their freedom, and allows them to rebel against Him in that particular moment, and in each subsequent particular moment, right? Again, there's nothing really incoherent about that, and that's what confuses me about some of his claims here. Is it's completely incoherent? Well, not necessarily, right? Okay, lots more to say, and I think I'm going to wrap this video up. It's getting late. I'm tired, and so anyway, enjoy reading DBH. We'll come back next time, and then we'll tackle, I guess, the second meditation.